The warm orange glow of the sunset slowly cast over the quiet streets of the suburban neighborhood, as if the world itself was retreating into a peaceful stillness. Nancy Drew, a black woman nearing her 8th month of pregnancy, drove her small car home from a doctor's appointment. Her hands gripped the steering wheel, feeling each deep, slow breath. A serene calm settled over her as she thought of her husband, William Smith. Her belly, round and full with the little life growing inside, reminded her of the deep connection she felt with their first child. Every kick brought a sense of hope and anticipation. She couldn't wait to tell William the good news from the doctor, that the baby was healthy, and in just a few more weeks, they would finally become parents. But the tranquility didn't last long. In the rearview mirror, Nancy noticed the flashing lights of a police car tailing her. A wave of anxiety surged through her. She hadn't been speeding. All her lights were working, and she couldn't think of any reason why she was being pulled over. Her heart began to race, and a cold shiver ran down her spine. As a black woman, Nancy had heard too many stories about tense encounters with the police, many of which ended in tragedy. Her husband, William, a prominent civil rights attorney, had shared countless stories with her about innocent people being threatened or attacked by the police, simply because of the color of their skin. Now she found herself living in the exact situation that had filled her with so much fear. Trying to stay calm, Nancy slowly pulled over to the side of the road. She took a deep breath, gripping the steering wheel tightly, glancing frequently at the rearview mirror. As the police car stopped behind her, she saw a white police officer step out. He walked toward her with an air of arrogance, one hand resting on his holster, as if preparing for the worst. The name Charles was stiffly embroidered on his uniform, but what caught Nancy's attention the most was his eyes. Cold, filled with disdain. It was as if the warmth of the sunset had suddenly been covered by a dark, ominous cloud. Nancy struggled to keep her composure and rolled down the window just slightly to hear what the officer had to say. "License and registration," Charles demanded, his voice sharp and without a trace of courtesy. His face was as cold as his tone, devoid of any kindness or empathy. Trembling, Nancy fumbled for her license and registration in her purse, feeling a strong kick from her baby, almost as if the child sensed the tension in the air. Her hands shook as she handed the documents to Charles, trying to stay silent. She hoped that if she remained quiet and didn't draw any attention, everything would pass without incident. But it didn't. Charles took the documents without even glancing at them. He simply stared at Nancy through the window, his eyes searching for something to latch onto. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his voice dripping with suspicion, as if her very presence was an affront. Nancy took a deep breath, trying to respond calmly. "I just came from a doctor's appointment. I'm on my way home," she said, her voice shaky but still firm. She had no idea why this officer was suspicious of her, but his gaze seemed to dissect her every word, waiting for a misstep. Charles didn't reply immediately. He glanced into her car, his eyes filled with contempt as if she had done something wrong. "What's in the car?" he suddenly asked, his tone sharp. "Drugs? Weapons?" He leaned down closer, his face almost pressed against the car window. His question left Nancy stunned. "No, officer. I don't have anything like that," she replied, her voice cracking with fear. Her hands gripped the steering wheel even tighter, her heart racing. This wasn't a normal traffic stop, and the officer's baseless suspicion made her feel like a criminal without cause. She didn't know what to do: stay silent and endure, or stand up for herself. Charles wasn't satisfied with her answer. "Get out of the car," he ordered, stepping back, his voice cold and commanding. Fear gripped Nancy's heart. She hadn't done anything wrong. Why was he asking her to get out of the car? "Officer, is there a reason?" she asked, trying to keep her voice gentle and non-confrontational. But inside, she was trembling. She looked around, hoping that someone, anyone, might witness what was happening and help her. But the streets were empty. No cars, no people. She was completely alone. Charles suddenly slammed his hand down on the roof of her car, his voice rising with anger. "I said, get out of the car, right now!" His face twisted with fury, his eyes becoming more menacing. Nancy could feel the threat in his words. This was no ordinary traffic stop. Something much darker and more dangerous was at play. Nancy's hands shook as she unbuckled her seatbelt and slowly opened the car door. She moved as carefully as she could, her large belly making every step heavy and difficult. But Charles didn't give her a chance to fully stand. As soon as she stepped out of the car, before she could steady herself, she felt a sharp, brutal kick to her side. The kick was fast, hard, and vicious. Nancy screamed in pain as she crumpled to the ground, her hands instinctively clutching her stomach in sheer panic. The kick had landed too close to her belly, where her baby was growing. She couldn't breathe. The air had been knocked from her lungs. What just happened? Why would he do that? Nancy looked up, her vision blurred by tears. Seeing the shadowy figure of Charles standing over her, his eyes cold and emotionless. He didn't care about her pain. He felt no remorse for attacking a pregnant woman. He just stood there, looking down at her, as if she was the one in the wrong. "Don't move," he growled, as if she were the one deserving punishment. Nancy gasped for breath, still holding her stomach. Fear for her baby overwhelmed her. Was the baby okay? She felt lost, defeated, and utterly powerless in the face of such brutality that she could never have imagined she would experience herself. Nancy lay there, her breaths shallow and uneven, with pain radiating throughout her body, as if every cell was resisting the shock she had just endured. The ground beneath her was cold and hard, but the deepest chill came from within, from the growing fear swelling inside her. She couldn't believe what had just happened. Charles's powerful kick had landed hard on her side, dangerously close to where her unborn child rested. Why would he do that? Why would a police officer, someone meant to protect citizens, attack her without cause, just because she was black? The question echoed in her mind, but no answer ever came. Tears streamed down her face, rolling over her cheeks uncontrollably. Nancy tried to hold back the panic, but it was impossible. She felt utterly powerless, as if the entire world had turned its back on her in that moment. Everything had happened so fast, so unexpectedly. Just minutes before, she had been driving home, filled with the joy of soon becoming a mother. And now here she was, lying on the ground, unsure if her baby was still safe. Charles's kick reverberated through her body, a haunting reminder of how fragile life could be. Nancy clutched her belly, trying to feel any movement from the baby. She was consumed with worry. Her child, the baby she had been eagerly awaiting for months. Was it okay? A flood of fear washed over her, nearly drowning out every other sensation. Her heart seemed to seize in her chest, racing uncontrollably. She tried to take deep breaths, but she couldn't focus, couldn't sense the presence of her baby. There was only an eerie silence, a silence that felt like an invisible warning. She had heard of the terrible things that could happen in attacks like this, and now she was living the very nightmare she had feared. Memories of past pain rushed back like a tidal wave, crashing over Nancy's mind. The pain she felt wasn't just from the harsh blow to her body, but from deep within her heart. She had lost a child before. That memory haunted her every time she closed her eyes. And now, the fear of losing another child rose stronger than ever. 2 years ago, when everything seemed perfect in the small life she and William had built, tragedy struck. Nancy had lost their first child in the 6th month of her pregnancy. It was a shock that no one could have anticipated, leaving a deep scar on both of them. Together, they had endured those painful months, with countless sleepless nights where Nancy cried endlessly, mourning the baby she never had the chance to hold in her arms. William, though always trying to appear strong, couldn't hide the pain in his eyes every time he saw his wife sinking into grief. They had lost a part of themselves, and that sense of loss had never fully gone away. Now, as Nancy carried another child, that same quiet fear had never truly left her mind. She had tried so hard to stay calm, to believe that everything would be fine this time, that they would finally meet their child. But Charles's brutal kick shattered that fragile hope. The kick didn't just knock her to the ground. It thrust her back into the terrifying memories of her past. As her body hit the cold pavement, everything seemed to go dark. She had lost all sense of feeling, except for the overwhelming fear. No, not again. She prayed in panic, her trembling hands resting on her belly, desperately hoping to feel any sign of movement from her baby. The fear of losing another child felt like an invisible hand squeezing her heart, making it beat erratically. She felt helpless, small, and more vulnerable than ever before. The horrifying thought that she might lose her baby again consumed her mind, while the pain from Charles's kick continued to throb throughout her body. What would William do when he found out about this? Nancy wondered, her heart heavy with worry. He wouldn't just be angry. He would be devastated. She knew this because he had never fully recovered from their previous loss. William had always been by her side, her emotional anchor whenever she felt weakest. He had endured the unspeakable pain of watching her lose a part of themselves. But what she feared most wasn't her pain. It was William's heartbreak if they lost this baby too. How would he cope, knowing that once again their hope could be taken from them? That fear engulfed Nancy like a wave, making her feel as though she were being swallowed by helplessness. She tried to listen to her body, to feel any sign from her baby. A small movement, any reassurance that her child was still okay. But all she felt was the pain spreading through her body and the terrifying thought that her baby might have been hurt beyond saving. At that moment, it felt as if everything was collapsing. Memories of those dark months when she had faced the first loss flooded back. She remembered the first time she and William had learned they were expecting, the overwhelming joy and the anticipation of a bright future. But then, like a sudden blow, that small life couldn't stay with them. William had been so strong, pulling her out of the depths of despair, and now she faced the same nightmare all over again. Nancy didn't know how she could bear this pain if it happened again. She didn't know if she had the strength to survive it, or if William could find the strength to stand tall once more. All she knew was that once again, they were standing on the brink of loss, and she had no idea if they would make it through this time. Alongside the physical pain was the unbearable emotional agony. Why her? Why had she become a victim of racism, of senseless violence? Nancy had never imagined she would be in this situation, a situation she had only heard about in heartbreaking stories. William, her husband, had told her countless times about similar cases, about innocent people abused by police officers who overstepped their power, but she never imagined it would happen to her. A pregnant woman, just driving home from a doctor's appointment. A wave of isolation and despair washed over Nancy. She tried to lift her head, scanning her surroundings for some small hope that someone would see her, that someone would witness this and come to help. But there was no one. No cars drove by, and no pedestrians stopped. The quiet suburban street she had once loved now felt cold and indifferent. The silence of the neighborhood that she used to find so peaceful now felt like a barrier separating her from the outside world, leaving her trapped in a nightmare with no escape. Nancy tried to sit up, but every movement sent sharp pains through her body. Her weakness made her feel smaller and more helpless than ever. She thought of William, wondering what he would do if he were here. He had always been the strong one in their life together, always knowing how to protect and shield her. But now, she was alone, facing this horror by herself. As Nancy struggled to focus and not be overwhelmed by the pain and fear, Charles stood there, showing no sign of guilt. His eyes were cold, devoid of any empathy, as if what had just happened was perfectly reasonable. He had no intention of helping her, calling for an ambulance, or apologizing. To him, Nancy was just a black woman, of no worth, unworthy of his concern or thought. "Don't try to move," Charles barked, his voice slicing through Nancy's fear like a sharp blade. He stood over her, acting as if everything he had done was justified, as if she was to blame for her very presence. The feeling of being disregarded and devalued overwhelmed Nancy, making her feel as though she had no worth in the eyes of others. Everything seemed to slow down. Nancy lay there, tears streaming down her face, feeling trapped in a nightmare she couldn't escape. Her thoughts spiraled, about her baby, about William, about the injustice she was suffering. Nancy couldn't understand why this had happened to her. She was just a mother driving home, and now here she was, in pain, desperate, unsure of what would happen next. She felt abandoned by the world, forgotten in this moment of pain and injustice. And Charles, standing over her with cold indifference, only deepened that pain. He didn't care about what he had done, and he had no intention of taking responsibility for his actions. To him, Nancy was just another statistic in the long line of people he had abused with his power. In the terrifying silence of the empty street, Nancy lay in her anguish and helplessness, not knowing what to do next. She needed a miracle, something to pull her out of this nightmare. But at that moment, all she could do was lie still, clutching her belly, and pray for the safety of the baby inside her. As Nancy lay on the ground, trying to calm herself and feel any sign of life from her unborn child, she suddenly heard the sound of hurried footsteps approaching. A young woman, named Amy, appeared beside her. Unlike the cruel officer, Amy's face was filled with worry and genuine concern. She was a passerby who had witnessed the entire incident from a distance. Amy knelt down, gently placing a hand on Nancy's shoulder, her voice shaky but soothing. "Are you okay? Let me help you." Nancy felt a warm wave of relief from the presence of this stranger. The feeling of loneliness and helplessness began to ease as someone came to her side, ready to help. Nancy tried to sit up, but the pain from the officer's kick made it difficult for her to stand. Amy didn't hesitate. She quickly bent down and helped lift Nancy, carefully and gently, so as not to cause her any more pain. "I'll take you home, okay? Don't worry. I won't leave you here," Amy whispered, her eyes never leaving Nancy. Nancy clung tightly to Amy, as though she were a lifeline in the middle of an ocean of panic. She didn't know who Amy was, but at that moment, Amy was the only light in the darkness. With care and kindness, Amy guided Nancy to her car. "Where's your house? I'll take you there," Amy asked, her voice warm and comforting. Nancy took a deep breath, trying to push aside the pain and fear that still surrounded her. "Thank you. My house isn't far, just a few blocks away," she said weakly, but enough for Amy to understand. Together, they made their way to Amy's car, each step a challenge for Nancy, but she knew she wasn't alone. As they drove towards Nancy's house, she couldn't stop the tears from flowing. She cried not just from the physical pain, but from the emotional exhaustion of reliving her past trauma all over again. Amy didn't ask many questions. She simply drove in silence, occasionally glancing over at Nancy with sympathy and understanding. "You're strong. Everything's going to be okay," Amy said softly, her voice like a balm of comfort, though Nancy wasn't entirely sure of it yet. When the car finally pulled up in front of Nancy's house, she turned to Amy, her eyes filled with tears, but also deep gratitude. "Thank you. I don't know what I would have done without you," Nancy gasped, clutching Amy's hand as though trying to express the depth of her thanks. Amy smiled gently and replied, "You don't need to thank me. We have to look out for each other in times like these. If you need anything else, don't hesitate to reach out to me." She handed Nancy a business card before helping her out of the car and into her home. At that moment, Nancy realized that no matter how cruel the world could be, there were still good people like Amy, people who were willing to stand up and help when they saw injustice. As she walked into her home, Nancy felt a small sense of peace, knowing that the challenges ahead wouldn't be easy, but at least she wasn't alone. The kindness of strangers could appear in the most unexpected places. Nancy lay on the sofa in her living room, the pain still lingering in her body. Her vision blurred with tears as she struggled to contain the fear and anguish inside her. The horrifying moments of Charles's attack played on a loop in her mind, like a haunting reel she couldn't escape. She hadn't yet gathered the courage to tell William, her beloved husband, what had happened. William, who had faced so much injustice in his career as a civil rights attorney, had fought tirelessly for others. But this was different. This time, Nancy was the victim. As she tried to come to terms with the horrifying reality of what had happened, her phone buzzed unexpectedly, pulling her out of her dark thoughts. It was a message from her best friend, Lisa. The message was brief, but filled with concern. "You have to see this right now." Attached is a video link. A mix of dread and curiosity welled up inside Nancy as she opened the video. The first few images made her heart race, and the shock hit her immediately. The video, recorded by a bystander's phone, had captured the entire incident. It began with Nancy stepping out of her car, clearly confused. She saw herself in the video, looking small and vulnerable. Distant voices could be heard in the background, commenting, "She looks scared." And then, within seconds, the scene of Charles brutally kicking her played out on the screen. Her scream, piercing and filled with pain, echoed in the video. Though the clip wasn't long, it captured the terrifying moment she had endured. As she collapsed to the ground, clutching her stomach, the sight was a painful reminder of what she had lived through. She took a deep breath, a cold wave rising in her chest, as she realized that now, it wasn't just her who knew what had happened. Thousands of others had also witnessed it through their screens. Moments later, her phone buzzed with an influx of messages from friends and acquaintances. Lisa messaged again, "Everyone is sharing this. We're all behind you." Messages of support and comfort flooded in, surprising and moving Nancy. "I can't believe this happened to you. I'm so sorry, Nancy, and I'm here for you," one friend wrote. Another text read, "We're going to get justice for you, Nancy. You're not alone." Yet, not all responses were supportive. A few people left negative comments, attempting to justify Charles's actions. "She must have done something wrong," one cold comment said. "If she'd just complied faster, maybe none of this would have happened." The unjust accusations and lack of empathy stung, but deep inside, Nancy's resilience began to rise. She knew these people couldn't understand the pain she was going through, and she realized that this fight wasn't just her own. It was a fight for a community oppressed for far too long. Within hours of the video going viral on social media, Nancy understood that the situation had spiraled beyond her control. Her video wasn't just being shared thousands of times across platforms. It had also caught the attention of major news outlets. Civil rights groups and organizations advocating against police brutality quickly noticed Nancy's case. Calls for action erupted everywhere. "Justice for Nancy," "Stop police violence," "End racism in law enforcement." Hashtags like "Justice for Nancy" and "End police brutality" began to trend, drawing in thousands of comments from people around the world. The local community where Nancy lived responded swiftly. Initially, it was just a small group of friends and neighbors who gathered outside the local police station. They held signs, standing firmly under the harsh sun, chanting, "Justice for Nancy." Placards bearing the words, "We demand justice," and "No one is above the law, not even the police," expressed the group's anger and determination. Nancy saw photos and videos of the protest filling her social media feeds, and she felt the strength of the support from her community. But the protest didn't stop there. From a small gathering, The crowd doubled, then tripled in size within hours. Family, friends, supporters, and even activists from surrounding areas arrived to stand in solidarity with Nancy. The scene grew more vibrant and impassioned as people from all walks of life joined in. Community leaders stepped up to speak, calling for justice not only for Nancy, but for all those who had suffered from discrimination and violence at the hands of the police. The chants for justice echoed not only from the streets, but also from local officials and human rights organizations. Some politicians publicly demanded a serious investigation into Charles's conduct, while also calling for reforms in law enforcement. Human rights groups held press conferences and delivered powerful speeches, declaring that Nancy's experience was a clear example of the injustice Black people face daily. The outrage and demands for change were no longer confined to the local level. National media began covering Nancy's story. Footage of the attack and the subsequent protests became a major focus in news segments. Well-known journalists and human rights advocates voiced their support for Nancy, demanding that authorities investigate and hold Charles accountable. To them, this wasn't just an isolated incident. It was emblematic of the larger systemic issues of injustice and abuse of power in society. From her home, Nancy sat quietly on the sofa, her eyes glued to her phone screen. A whirlwind of emotions surged through her, an overwhelming flood she could barely control. Her hands trembled, tightening and loosening in response to the torrent of feelings swirling inside her. Never in her life had she imagined that what had happened to her would spread so quickly or draw such wide attention. It felt like she was living in a dream, or perhaps a nightmare. The image of her being attacked, Charles's brutal kick, the gasps for air, and his cold, indifferent stare all replayed in her mind. The pain she felt wasn't only in the bruises on her body, the physical agony from the kick to her side, the fear for her unborn child, was only part of it. The emotional wounds weighed heavier. Her dignity had been torn apart as she was treated as if she were worthless, as though she was nobody, someone not deserving of respect simply because of the color of her skin. That feeling of being demeaned and disrespected could never be erased. The injustice weighed on her heart, making it hard to breathe. She couldn't stop thinking about why this had happened to her and how she would face it. In those moments, a deep fear rose within Nancy. She feared that this case, like so many before, would be forgotten, swallowed by the legal system she had heard too many stories about, where justice was rarely served. William had told her countless times about people who had fought but never saw justice. People who were abandoned by the system were crushed by the power and protection that the police were afforded. Would her story become one of those? Would she be forgotten, lost in a sea of excuses and unjustified reasoning? But now, as she sat there, the screen of her phone lighting up with hundreds of messages of encouragement, with thousands of shares from the community, Nancy felt that this time was different. Despite the pain and trauma from the attack, she realized that she wasn't alone this time. This time, so many people were standing behind her, supporting her fight for justice. Messages from strangers she had never met, comments expressing outrage at Charles's actions, all of it gave her a glimmer of hope, a small light amid the dark storm. The community had risen to defend her. They weren't going to let her story be forgotten like so many before. Nancy felt a faint hope grow in her heart, that this time, the truth would come to light, that justice wouldn't fade away into darkness. She could feel the strength from those around her, from people she had never met, but who were now deeply connected to her through their shared outrage and determination. They had seen the injustice she endured, and they wouldn't let it be swept under the rug. Message after message of support continued to pop up on her screen. One comment read, "Nancy, we're here so you don't have to fight this alone." Another person shared, "They can't keep doing this. We won't let it happen to anyone else. We're standing with you." Every word felt like a balm to Nancy, letting her know that the pain she was experiencing wasn't meaningless. In the quiet of her small home, she sat there, holding her belly protectively. She thought about what William always told her about fighting injustice, about the courage he always encouraged her to hold on to. She didn't have to face this alone. William would be home soon, and he would know how to fight. But this time, it wasn't just him. The whole community, the people who had witnessed the video, who had seen the brutality, who had felt her pain, they wouldn't let her fight alone. Nancy took a deep breath. The fear was still there, but now, it no longer paralyzed her. She had been hurt and mistreated, but no one could extinguish her hope. She knew the fight for justice wouldn't be easy, but this time, she felt she could stand stronger, with the support of people she hadn't even met, people who had lit the way for her, and who would stand with her as she faced this battle. As the video of Charles's attack on Nancy spread like wildfire across social media, sparking outrage within the community, William Smith, Nancy's husband, sat in his law office, feeling as though his heart had been crushed. William, a renowned civil rights attorney, had spent his entire career fighting for the oppressed, for victims of police brutality and racial discrimination. But never had he imagined that the person in need of his protection would be his wife, the woman he loved more than anything. Just hours before, he had been consumed by court cases and the demands of his day-to-day work. But when messages from friends and colleagues alerted him to the video of Nancy, everything changed. At first, he couldn't believe it. His wife, Nancy, was assaulted by a police officer in broad daylight simply because of the color of her skin. Rage boiled inside him as he watched the video. Each kick from Charles felt like it hit William directly, and every cry of pain from Nancy in the video was like a knife to his heart. She wasn't just his wife. She was carrying their first child. William couldn't sit by and let this go unpunished. He knew he had to act immediately. This fight was no longer just about defending the rights of strangers. It was now about protecting his own family, his wife and child. William felt the immense weight of responsibility bearing down on his shoulders. He had fought for justice for others, but now the battle was more personal than ever. He resolved not only to defend Nancy, but to fight for systemic change, to ensure that people like Charles, who abused their power, would face real consequences. William quickly got to work. He knew this wouldn't just be about prosecuting one police officer for assault. It was a fight against the deep-seated racism and violence embedded within law enforcement. He began compiling evidence and making calls to his colleagues, friends in the legal field, and human rights organizations. William understood that to win this battle, he would need to prepare for a long, hard fight. But this time, he wouldn't allow any injustice to slip through the cracks without being challenged. Meanwhile, Charles wasn't immediately concerned. A police officer with over 10 years of service, he had faced complaints about his behavior before, but had always been shielded by his colleagues and the police union. Protected by the system, he had always felt untouchable. Complaints about racism or abuse of power were just numbers on a report to him, something he never had to worry about. But when Charles realized the woman he had attacked wasn't just any anonymous victim, but the wife of William Smith, a prominent civil rights lawyer with a string of legal victories in cases against police brutality and racial discrimination, fear began to creep in. William wasn't just any lawyer. He was someone the legal system respected. Charles had heard William's name mentioned in police meetings, in discussions about high-profile cases that William had won. And now, William was the one going after him. Charles's initial smugness and arrogance faded completely. He started to panic as he thought about what lay ahead. The video of the attack had gone viral. It wasn't something that could be easily swept under the rug like before. The community was demanding justice for Nancy, and the worst part for Charles was knowing that William wouldn't stop until justice was served. This case had become a lightning rod for the community, and Charles knew this time he wouldn't escape the consequences. In the police station, Charles sat alone in his small office, feeling the pressure weigh down on him. The noise from the protests outside only heightened his anxiety. He knew that while the police union might protect him, as they had in the past, this time the situation was different. He had picked the wrong target. William Smith wasn't someone who would back down, and Charles knew that well. He understood that his future could be destroyed, his career over, and worse, he could even face prison time if the legal battle didn't go in his favor. Charles's fellow officers, who had once laughed and joked with him about past complaints, were now beginning to distance themselves. They recognized that this time wasn't like the others. William was a formidable opponent, and they didn't want to get caught in the crossfire. The pressure from the public, from human rights organizations, and the legal system made them uneasy. Some of Charles's colleagues even began discussing whether they should sever ties with him to avoid being dragged into the lawsuit. The more Charles thought about it, the more fearful he became. He had once been so confident in his power, but now that arrogance was crumbling. William wasn't just a husband fighting for his wife. He was a powerful lawyer with the ability to change the system. Charles knew that if he didn't figure out a way to mitigate the situation quickly, he was facing an inevitable downfall. Meanwhile, William pushed forward with his legal battle. He didn't just want Charles to be held accountable. He wanted to change an entire system. William knew this fight wouldn't be easy, but he couldn't stand by and watch his wife and family be harmed without doing something. He was determined not only to secure justice for Nancy, but also for all the other victims who had been unjustly treated at the hands of officers like Charles. With unwavering determination and a strong belief in justice, William braced himself for a long and grueling legal fight. But deep down, his love for Nancy and his faith in what was right fueled him, and he knew he would never back down. He would do everything in his power to protect his family and ensure that this injustice wouldn't be forgotten. William didn't stop at merely suing Charles. He knew that to truly achieve justice for Nancy and create meaningful change, he had to expose the entire system that had protected and enabled officers like Charles for years. The moment the decision to sue was made, William immediately mobilized his legal team to gather evidence, not only about the attack on Nancy, but also regarding Charles's history of violence and racial discrimination. Sitting in his office, phone in hand, William called upon trusted colleagues in the civil rights law community. Rachel, an experienced lawyer who had handled cases of police brutality, was the first to join. "We'll find what we need to hold him accountable," Rachel said with conviction, her voice full of determination. The team quickly gathered and began combing through records, contacting witnesses, and searching for any past incidents involving Charles. William was certain that Charles wasn't just a one-time offender. Like many similar cases, he suspected Charles had been abusing his power for years, while the police department turned a blind eye. They needed to prove not only the assault on Nancy, but also to build a complete picture of Charles's long-standing pattern of violent and discriminatory behavior. The goal was to hold Charles, and the system that protected him, accountable. In the days that followed, William and his team worked tirelessly. They began by reviewing public records, sifting through any complaints of excessive force or racial bias connected to Charles. Their initial findings confirmed William's suspicions. A series of complaints had been filed against Charles for using excessive force, particularly against people of color. However, all these incidents had either been dismissed or quietly handled internally without significant repercussions. This didn't surprise William. He knew all too well how the police system shielded its officers, especially those who abused their power like Charles. As they dug deeper, a critical breakthrough occurred. A whistleblower from within the police department contacted William via an anonymous email. "You need to see these emails," the message read. Attached is a series of internal police department emails. William opened each one carefully, and what he found confirmed his worst fears. The emails made it clear that Charles had been the subject of multiple complaints for racial discrimination and unnecessary violence. But the department heads had actively worked to cover them up. They had either ignored or dismissed the complaints, allowing Charles to believe he could act without consequence. One particularly damning email came from Charles's superior, discussing how to handle a complaint about him roughing up a young black man. "We need to keep this quiet," the email read. "It won't look good for the department if this gets out." The cold, calculating nature of the email hit William like a punch to the gut. It was undeniable evidence that the police department had knowingly protected Charles and others like him, despite serious misconduct. William knew these emails would be key evidence in the lawsuit. They didn't just prove Charles's abuse of power. They implicated the entire police system in enabling such behavior. With this evidence, William could aim not only to bring Charles to justice, but to expose the department that had shielded him for so long. Rachel immediately set to work, verifying the emails and preparing the legal case. "We've got what we need, William," she said confidently. "These emails will make the entire system bow." Meanwhile, Charles began to feel the weight of the situation closing in on him. Initially, he hadn't been worried. He thought this would be just another complaint, like so many before, something the department would cover up as usual. But when rumors spread through the precinct that William had obtained internal emails, Charles began to panic. He realized that this time, things were beyond his control. It wasn't just a matter of evading public criticism through the police department's usual cover-ups anymore. This time, William, Nancy's husband, and a renowned civil rights lawyer, held evidence that could destroy Charles's career and life. Charles could feel everything crumbling around him. The colleagues who had once laughed and joked with him about previous complaints now started keeping their distance. They knew that with the evidence William had, there was no saving Charles if the case went to trial. He felt increasingly isolated, understanding that the road ahead was dark and filled with inevitable consequences. All the while, William and his team continued to strengthen their case, gathering every piece of evidence they could. With each passing day, they moved closer to uncovering the truth about Charles and the police department's efforts to conceal his wrongdoings. William understood that this lawsuit wasn't just about getting justice for Nancy. It was about fighting for all the victims who had suffered under the abuse of officers like Charles. With each piece of evidence, every witness statement, and especially the damning internal emails, William and his team prepared for the legal battle ahead. They knew that with the weight of the evidence in hand, they could bring Charles to light and dismantle the system that had protected him for years. As William and his team continued to solidify their case with irrefutable evidence, not only Nancy, but the entire community could feel the power and momentum of this legal battle. The leaked internal emails, which revealed that the police department had protected Charles for years, shocked the public. This was no longer just an isolated incident of police violence. Nancy's fight for justice had escalated into a larger movement against abuse of power and systemic racism within law enforcement. William understood that the lawsuit he and Nancy were pursuing was not just a singular case. It represented all the black individuals who had been subjected to violence and injustice because of their skin color. As the internal evidence spread, the public's demand for justice grew louder. What had begun as a small group of protesters outside the police station, armed with signs and chants, had now swelled to hundreds of people flooding the streets, all united in support of Nancy and demanding accountability. Protests spread throughout the city, with signs reading, "Justice for Nancy," "Stand against police violence," and "We will not be silent anymore." Activists, community leaders, and even celebrities joined the movement, turning Nancy's story into a national cause. Demonstrations were no longer confined to Nancy City. They spread far and wide. Images of Nancy, the brutal kick from Charles, and the demands for justice dominated major media outlets, from newspapers to national television. On social media, the hashtag #JusticeForNancy continued to spread rapidly. Thousands of people from all over the country shared her story, expressing outrage at the legal system that had long concealed and protected officers like Charles. Posts, calls to action, and videos from the protests flooded online platforms. The public wasn't just demanding justice for Nancy. They were calling for systemic reform, pushing for a fair and just law enforcement system for everyone, regardless of race. Meanwhile, Charles began to feel the crushing pressure closing in on him. At first, he had dismissed this as another routine complaint, something that would soon be swept under the rug. But with the growing protests and the mounting media attention on William and Nancy's case, Charles began to panic. He knew that his career could collapse at any moment. The days when he confidently stood at the police station, shielded by the protection of the police union, felt like distant memories. His colleagues, who had once stood by him, were now beginning to distance themselves, wary of the potential legal fallout. Charles felt increasingly isolated, abandoned by the very institution that had once protected him. The police station, once a place of security, had become a hostile environment filled with criticism and pressure from the public. Sitting in his office, Charles nervously clutched his phone, desperately searching for any news or information that could turn the situation in his favor. He anxiously watched the news, where the lawsuit filed by William and Nancy was the hot topic of the day. Each report, every interview, and every article only made his anxiety grow, especially when William appeared on screen. Calm, yet resolute, Charles felt a wave of panic wash over him. William wasn't someone who would give up. He wouldn't stop until justice was served. Charles's crisis deepened when his former allies in the police department began to turn their backs on him. Some higher-ups even ordered him to remain silent, to avoid the media, and to refrain from defending himself. They knew that standing by Charles in this situation could drag the entire department into a scandal. Rumors circulated that someone would need to be made a scapegoat, and Charles slowly realized that it would likely be him bearing the full brunt of the fallout. On the other side of this battle, William continued preparing for the lawsuit. He knew that the escalating protests had captured the nation's attention, but his primary focus was securing a legal victory. William and his team didn't stop at the internal emails they had already obtained. They dug even deeper into Charles's past. They uncovered more evidence of racial discrimination and abuse of power, not only in Nancy's case, but in many others that had previously been covered up. With each passing day, the pressure on Charles mounted. The protests in the streets grew louder and more intense, while fiery speeches from civil rights leaders made it clear to Charles that there was no way out this time. The lawsuit was no longer just about protecting his reputation. It was about the survival of his career, his freedom, and his future. Throughout this grueling battle, William never lost sight of why he was fighting, not just for Nancy, but also for the unborn child she carried. He knew that if their lawsuit succeeded, it would not only bring justice to his family, but also to countless others, black men and women who had been brutalized and oppressed by the hands of law enforcement. This was no longer a personal fight. It had become a movement for deep, systemic change in society. The struggle continued to intensify. As William prepared for the upcoming trial, he could feel the overwhelming support from the community and from millions of people across the country. With the evidence they had gathered and the truth beginning to emerge, William was determined that this time, justice would not be denied. As the movement for justice for Nancy spread across the nation and the pressure on Charles mounted, William knew the pivotal moment had arrived. The trial date was set, and it would be the place where he and his team would present the full truth about the brutal attack and Charles's abuse of power. This was not merely a trial of one police officer. It was a symbol of the fight against racism and violence embedded within law enforcement. On the morning of the trial, the courtroom was packed. Citizens, activists, and media had gathered to witness the outcome of a case that had captured national attention. William sat in the front row, with Nancy beside him, her face tense, but filled with determination. She knew that this was not just her fight. It was the voice of thousands who had endured similar injustices. Across the room, Charles sat in a light gray suit, his face pale. The smugness and arrogance that once defined him were gone, replaced by an unmistakable fear. He knew what was coming. The evidence was overwhelming, and William was not an opponent he could underestimate. As the trial began, William rose to present his case. He started by recounting the events of that fateful day, emphasizing the racial bias Charles had exhibited when he stopped Nancy and the threats he had made against her simply because of her skin color. William didn't just focus on Nancy's experience. He wove in Charles's past incidents, detailing previous instances where Charles had abused his power and used violence against people of color. Each piece of evidence that William laid out was like another brick in the wall, slowly painting a picture of a police officer who had repeatedly overstepped his authority and a police department that had shielded him for too long. William didn't stop at the current evidence. He brought out the internal police department emails, those that exposed the systemic cover-up of Charles's actions. Reading the emails aloud to the jury, William made it clear that not only was Charles guilty, but the entire system that had protected him was also complicit. Charles's actions were not just personal failings, William declared, his voice resolute. They are the result of a system that has allowed racial bias and violence to flourish unchecked for far too long. The jury sat in silence, their eyes fixed on William as he continued his argument. The undeniable evidence, the testimonies of witnesses, and the historical record of Charles's behavior formed an irrefutable case. William's every word, every piece of evidence presented in court, helped the jury understand that this was not just about Nancy's attack. It was about a broader issue of power abuse in law enforcement. As the trial progressed, Charles grew increasingly anxious. He sat motionless, watching as the case against him unraveled before his eyes. Every piece of evidence, every argument William presented made Charles realize that this time there would be no escape. Finally, after days of testimony and evidence, the trial neared its conclusion. William rose once more to deliver his closing argument. "This is not an isolated incident," he began, his voice firm and unwavering. "This is a clear example of the abuse of power that individuals like Charles have inflicted on innocent citizens simply because of their skin color. But today, we have the opportunity to change that. We have the chance to declare that no one, no matter how powerful, can abuse their authority without facing consequences." The jury nodded quietly as they listened to William's words. His closing statement reverberated through the courtroom, reminding everyone of the importance of the justice he was fighting to protect. There was no doubt. William had convinced them. After the jury left the room to deliberate, the tension in the courtroom became almost unbearable. Nancy gripped William's hand tightly, her eyes filled with hope, but shadowed by fear. She knew that the outcome of this trial would not only affect her and William, but would stand as a symbol for the broader fight against injustice in society. Finally, after hours of deliberation, the jury returned to the courtroom. The air was thick with anticipation as everyone waited for the final verdict. The judge asked the jury if they had reached a decision. The foreman stood, eyes fixed on the judge. "Your Honor," he said, his voice steady, "we find the defendant, Charles, guilty of assault and abuse of power." A wave of murmurs swept through the courtroom, quickly followed by applause and cheers from the community. Cries of "Justice for Nancy!" echoed through the room. Nancy exhaled, tears streaming down her face as she turned to William, embracing him tightly. This wasn't just their victory. It was a victory for an entire community that had been oppressed for far too long. Charles sat frozen, his face drained of color, eyes wide in horror. Everything he had believed in, the protection of the system, his perceived invincibility, had crumbled. He knew his life would never be the same again. As William held Nancy close, He knew that this battle was far from over. They had won an important victory, but there was still much work to be done to reform the system that had caused so much harm. But at least today, justice has been served. And that was the first step in a long journey to combat violence and racism. As the trial concluded, and applause and cheers echoed through the courtroom, William and Nancy couldn't hide the relief that washed over them. Nancy wiped away tears of happiness, while William held her hand tightly, feeling his heartbeats slowly returning to a normal rhythm after months of tension. They had fought hard and remained resilient, and now justice had been served. Charles, the man who had caused Nancy so much pain, was finally held accountable for his abuse of power. It wasn't just their victory. It was a symbol of hope and fairness in a system that had long been broken. However, despite the relief, both William and Nancy knew their fight was far from over. Bringing Charles to trial was only the first step in a much longer journey. William understood better than anyone that there were many other officers like Charles, abusing their power and oppressing vulnerable people based on race and status. They both knew that while justice had been served for Nancy, thousands of others were still waiting for their voices to be heard. With that in mind, William and Nancy made a promise. They wouldn't stop here. After the trial, as the flashlights of the press cameras flickered continuously, William spoke to the media. "This isn't just about Nancy," he said, his voice filled with determination. "This is about all the people who have suffered violence and discrimination without ever having the chance to seek justice. We're not stopping here. Our fight will continue, not just for my family, but for everyone who needs us to speak out." His speech was met with applause from the community, who had followed and supported the case from the beginning. The feeling of relief and victory blended in the air as William and Nancy returned home. But even though the victory was sweet, they couldn't ignore the fact that the fight for justice was far from over. Nancy, now feeling safer after everything she had been through, knew that her and William's responsibility was not just to protect their family, but also to advocate for change within the community. "We have to keep going," she said to William as they sat together in the living room. "Not just for us, but for all the others out there." Their conversation didn't stop there. Both of them understood that while justice had partially been served in Nancy's case, the system of discrimination was still in place, affecting thousands of others. "We might have won this battle, but the bigger war is still ongoing." William sighed, his eyes showing firm resolve. "We can't just sit back because our family is safe. It's time for us to start organizing workshops, giving talks, to speak about what happened and help people better understand the injustices they might face." Nancy nodded in agreement, recalling the helplessness she felt when attacked and the subsequent struggle to be heard and believed. "Many people aren't as fortunate as we are. They don't have a voice. They aren't protected by the law. We have a responsibility to help them, to help those who don't have the chance to stand up and claim their rights," Nancy said softly, but with deep determination. And so, they began planning for the future. William, with his expertise and influence in the legal world, was determined to push for deep reforms within the police system. He knew that real change couldn't come from one court case or a single legal battle. Instead, it would require sustained efforts to improve the entire system. William outlined a strategy, working alongside colleagues, lawyers, social activists, and trusted politicians. They organized workshops and political rallies, and consistently pressured law enforcement agencies to demand change. One of William's primary focuses was reforming police training practices. He believed the issue went beyond individual officers abusing power. It stemmed from how they were trained and how the system protected and enabled them. William proposed mandatory training on professional ethics, human rights, and de-escalation techniques to handle situations without violence. Additionally, he called for independent oversight agencies to investigate complaints of police misconduct. His vision extended to creating a legal framework, ensuring that no one, regardless of race or background, would be subjected to injustice without recourse. However, William knew that to succeed, he couldn't do it alone. He collaborated with social activists and NGOs to build a powerful coalition where people could unite under a common cause. Their campaigns weren't limited to courtrooms and meetings. They also took to the streets, using public demonstrations to amplify their message. "We can't stop at one lawsuit," William declared. "We must continue until these reforms become law, so no one else has to go through what Nancy endured." Nancy, too, played a pivotal role. After the physical and emotional trauma, she discovered a strength within herself that she hadn't recognized before. She realized that her story could inspire others, women, people of color, and anyone who had been mistreated by a system built to oppress. Nancy began engaging in community activism, sharing her story at events and rallies. Each time she spoke, she felt the support and empathy of those who, like her, were fighting for justice. Gradually, Nancy became a representative for victims of violence and racial injustice. Together with social activists, she helped found charitable organizations that provided both legal and psychological support to those in need. Each time she stood in front of a crowd, she carried with her the hope that her story would become a powerful call for social change. "We are not alone," she would say. "Every voice raised is a step closer to justice." While both William and Nancy dedicated themselves to their social and political work, they never forgot to prepare for their family's future. Both of them knew their first child was due soon, and they wanted to create a better world for their child to grow up in. Every time William placed his hand on Nancy's growing belly, his eyes gleamed with hope for the future. "We're going to make it," he said. "We'll build a world where our child can grow up without fear or worry because of their skin color." Nancy shared that belief. She knew their child would grow up in a world filled with challenges, but she and William would never stop fighting. They weren't just doing this for their child. They were fighting for all children, ensuring that the world would be more just and fair for future generations. What William and Nancy were doing wasn't just about protecting their family. It was about bringing real change to society. Their story became a source of motivation for thousands, and they slowly became symbols of the fight against violence, racism, and the abuse of power. Their journey didn't stop at finding justice for Nancy. It opened a new chapter, filled with hope and strength, where they would continue to fight tirelessly for a better society. In the years to come, with their love for each other and their unshakable determination, William and Nancy would continue to lead the charge in advocating for social reform. They wouldn't stop fighting, not just for their child, but for millions of others, ensuring that the future they dreamed of, a future of justice, equality, and love, would one day become reality. Thank you for following this story to the end. What do you think about this situation? Should the police officer face even harsher consequences? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. And if you found this story thought-provoking, don't forget to hit like, share, and subscribe to our channel so we can bring you more meaningful stories. See you in the next video.
Sarah Johnson stood in her kitchen one sunny morning, looking at the calendar hanging on her refrigerator. She had circled May 15th multiple times with a red marker. Her son Marcus's 10th birthday was just 2 weeks away. As an elementary school teacher at Pine Grove Elementary, Sarah knew how important birthdays were to children, and she wanted to make this one extra special. "Marcus deserves the best party this year," she said to her husband David, who was making coffee. "He's worked so hard and won first place in the science fair last month." David nodded in agreement while stirring his coffee. At 6'2", he was a gentle giant in the community, known for his work as a local community organizer who helped bring people together. "You're right, honey. Let's make it unforgettable." The Johnsons had lived in their suburban home on Maple Street for 5 years. Their 2-story house with the blue shutters and well-kept garden was a source of pride. Most of their neighbors were friendly and supportive, often stopping by for barbecues or community meetings that David organized. Sarah sat at their kitchen table, opening her laptop to start planning. She created a checklist that grew longer by the minute. Bounce house rental, DJ for kid-friendly music, science-themed decorations, food and drinks, games and activities, party favors, permits for the bounce house. We should let the neighbors know about the party, David suggested, looking over her shoulder at the list. Maybe we can hand out notices this weekend. Sarah agreed immediately. They had always maintained good relationships with their neighbors through open communication and respect. She designed a simple notice on her computer. Dear neighbors, our son Marcus is turning 10. We're hosting a birthday party on Saturday, May 15th, from 2 p.m. to 6 p.m. There will be music and a bounce house. We appreciate your understanding, and you're welcome to stop by for cake, the Johnson family. Over the next few days, Sarah and David hand-delivered the notices to every house on their street. Most neighbors responded with warm smiles and congratulations. Mrs. Rodriguez from next door even offered to help with the preparations, and Mr. Chen from across the street said his son Tommy was excited to attend. However, when they reached the last house on their street, the reception was different. Karen Weber, who had moved in 6 months ago, barely opened her door. She took the notice with 2 fingers as if it were something unpleasant, her face twisting into a frown. A party? There will be noise, she asked, her voice sharp. Yes, we'll keep it reasonable, David assured her with his usual friendly smile. It's just for a few hours in the afternoon. Karen's eyes narrowed as she looked past them at their house. We'll see about that, she muttered before closing her door. Sarah and David exchanged glances but decided not to let one negative response dampen their spirits. They had too much planning to do. The next 2 weeks flew by in a blur of preparations. Sarah ordered a science-themed cake from the local bakery, featuring planets, test tubes, and mathematical symbols made from fondant. Marcus had recently developed a strong interest in science, especially after winning the science fair with his project on solar energy. David took care of the permits for the bounce house and hired a local DJ who specialized in children's parties. He also bought several folding tables and chairs from a party supply store. Sarah spent her evenings after school creating science-themed decorations. She made molecule models from styrofoam balls and painted them in bright colors. She also designed a mad scientist photo booth with lab coats, safety goggles, and silly props. The day before the party, their doorbell rang. It was Officer James Martinez from the local police department, where Sarah volunteered teaching kids as part of the community youth program. Hey, Mrs. Johnson, he smiled. Just dropping off some safety coloring books for your students. Oh, and I heard about Marcus's party tomorrow. My nephew Tommy Chen can't stop talking about it. Thanks, Officer Martinez, Sarah replied warmly. You're welcome to stop by if you're in the neighborhood. As Sarah watched Officer Martinez walk back to his patrol car, she felt grateful for their strong community connections. Little did she know how important these relationships would prove to be during tomorrow's party. The evening before the big day, Sarah and David sat on their porch, reviewing their checklist one final time. Everything was ready for what they hoped would be a perfect celebration of their son's special day. However, they couldn't shake off the feeling that Karen Weber's cold response might mean trouble. The morning of Marcus's birthday dawned bright and clear. Sarah Johnson woke up at 6 a.m., even though it was a Saturday. She couldn't help but feel excited as she looked out the window at their backyard, imagining how it would transform in the next few hours. Marcus was still sleeping when David carried tables and chairs into the backyard. The morning dew made the grass sparkle as he arranged 5 round tables in a semicircle. Each table would seat 4 children, with extra chairs placed around for parents who wanted to stay. Need some help? Called a friendly voice. It was Mr. Chen from across the street, already dressed for the day. He walked over with his toolbox. I thought you might need an extra pair of hands. David smiled gratefully. Thanks. The bounce house company is coming at 8. Could you help me clear this area? As they worked, Mrs. Rodriguez from next door arrived with her teenage daughter Maria. They carried homemade breakfast burritos and coffee for everyone. You can't set up on an empty stomach, Mrs. Rodriguez insisted, setting up the food on one of the tables. By 8 a.m., the bounce house delivery truck pulled up. 2 workers efficiently began setting up the large blue and white structure. It had a science theme, with pictures of planets and atoms printed on its sides, perfect for Marcus's interests. David made sure to show them the permit right away, and they placed the bounce house exactly where it was allowed. Sarah came outside after waking Marcus and giving him his first birthday present, a new science encyclopedia he'd been wanting. She gasped in happiness when she saw how many neighbors had come to help. Mr. Wilson, a retired teacher, was hanging streamers between trees. His wife was setting up the science-themed photo booth Sarah had made. The DJ called. Sarah told David as she helped arrange the science decorations. He'll be here at 1 p.m. to set up, an hour before the party starts. He's bringing his own power supply, so we won't overload any circuits. Around 9 a.m., they noticed Karen Weber standing at her window, watching them with a frown. She had her phone in her hand and appeared to be taking pictures. David waved friendly at her, but she quickly closed her curtains. "Don't let her bother you," Mrs. Rodriguez whispered to Sarah. "Some people just can't stand seeing others happy." More neighbors arrived to help as the morning went on. The Patel family brought their ladder to hang lights in the trees. The Smiths helped set up the food tables and decorated them with blue tablecloths and science-themed centerpieces. Everyone worked together like a well-oiled machine. Marcus finally came outside at 10 a.m., and his eyes grew wide with amazement. "Mom, Dad, this is awesome," he exclaimed, running around to look at everything. His new birthday outfit, a t-shirt with a periodic table design, matched perfectly with the party theme. At 11 a.m., the cake arrived from Sweet Dreams Bakery. It was even better than Sarah had imagined. 3 tiers of blue and silver, decorated with edible test tubes, beakers, and planets. The baker had even added a small microscope made of fondant on top with Marcus's name. "Look at that cake," Marcus said excitedly. "It's like a real laboratory." Sarah noticed Karen Weber had come outside to water her plants. She was clearly watching them again, shaking her head disapprovingly at all the activity. This time, she was writing something in a small notebook. "Everything's legal," David said quietly to Sarah, noticing her concern. "We have all our permits, and we're not breaking any rules." By noon, the backyard had transformed into a child's dream party space. Science posters hung on the fence, showing interesting facts about space, chemistry, and physics. The bounce house swayed gently in the breeze. 5 activity stations were set up. The Mad Scientist photo booth, make your own slime station, build a robot corner, planet painting area, science experiment show space. "I can't believe how amazing this looks," Sarah said, standing back to admire their work. "Thank you, everyone, for helping." The neighbors who had helped beamed with pride at what they'd accomplished together. Even Officer Martinez, who was off duty, had stopped by to drop off safety cones for the front of the house where kids would be dropped off. As the clock moved toward 1 p.m., Sarah felt both excited and a little nervous. Everything was perfect, maybe too perfect. She couldn't shake the feeling that Karen Weber was planning something, but she tried to focus on what mattered, making Marcus's 10th birthday a day he would never forget. At exactly 2 p.m., the first guests began arriving at the Johnsons' house. Marcus stood by the front door with his parents, greeting his friends with a big smile on his face. He wore his new periodic table t-shirt proudly, and his eyes sparkled with excitement. Tommy Chen was the first to arrive, carrying a large wrapped present. "Happy birthday, Marcus," he shouted, giving his best friend a high five. Tommy's parents followed behind, bringing extra snacks to help out. Within 15 minutes, the front of the house was busy with arriving families. The DJ played upbeat, kid-friendly music at a reasonable volume, creating a fun atmosphere. Parents chatted while children rushed to explore the different science stations set up around the backyard. "Look at the slime station," squealed Emily Rodriguez, one of Marcus's classmates from school. She and 3 other girls immediately headed there, where Mrs. Rodriguez helped them mix the safe ingredients to make colorful, stretchy slime. At the Build-A-Robot corner, David helped a group of boys construct simple robots using recycled materials. They used cardboard boxes, aluminum foil, and safe craft supplies to create their mechanical friends. Marcus showed everyone how to attach the moving parts, remembering what he learned from his science fair project. "Everyone, gather around." Sarah called out at 2:30 p.m., "It's time for our first science experiment show." 20 excited children sat on blankets spread on the grass. Mr. Wilson, The retired science teacher stood at a table filled with safe materials for demonstrations. He wore a white lab coat and safety goggles, looking like a real scientist. "Who wants to see a volcano erupt?" Mr. Wilson asked, holding up a model volcano. "Me!" All the children shouted together, raising their hands high in the air. As Mr. Wilson added vinegar to the baking soda mixture, creating a satisfying foam explosion, Sarah noticed Karen Weber standing at her window again. This time, she had her phone out and appeared to be recording the party. Her face looked angry as she watched the children's joy. The party continued with more activities. At the planet painting area, children created their own solar systems using special paint that would glow in the dark. The mad scientist photo booth was busy with kids trying on lab coats and making funny faces with test tubes and beakers as props. "Time for the bounce house," David announced at 3 p.m. The children lined up excitedly, taking turns in groups of 5, just as the safety rules required. Marcus helped organize his friends, making sure everyone got a fair turn. From her window, Karen Weber was now talking on her phone, gesturing angrily toward the party. She kept pointing at the bounce house and the children playing, but the party was following all safety rules and noise regulations. "The cake looks amazing," Marcus exclaimed when they brought it out at 3:30 p.m. 20 children gathered around the science-themed masterpiece, their eyes wide with wonder at the edible laboratory design. Everyone sang "Happy Birthday" together, their voices joining in harmony. Marcus closed his eyes, made a wish, and blew out all 10 candles in one breath. The children cheered as Sarah started cutting the cake, making sure everyone got a piece with their favorite decoration. "Best party ever," Tommy said, his face covered in blue frosting. Other children nodded in agreement, their mouths full of cake and ice cream. Parents chatted happily in small groups, complimenting Sarah and David on the wonderful party. Many took pictures of their children doing experiments or posing in the photo booth. The community feeling was strong and warm. Officer Martinez, who had stopped by earlier, returned in his patrol car. He was still off duty, but wanted to see how the party was going. He grabbed a piece of cake and watched the children play with a smile on his face. "Everything's perfect," he told Sarah. "You've done a great job keeping things organized and safe." As the afternoon continued, more science experiments amazed the children. They made rainbow paper using water and markers, created static electricity with balloons, and learned about density by floating different objects in water. The DJ kept the music fun but not too loud, playing songs that made the children dance and laugh. Even some parents joined in when he played the periodic table song, which was Marcus's favorite. At 4:30 p.m., Karen Weber finally came outside. She stood at the edge of her property, writing in her notebook and taking more pictures. Her face showed clear disapproval, but she hadn't found any real reason to complain yet. The party was everything Marcus had hoped for and more. His friends were having fun, the science activities were a huge hit, and the community had come together to make his special day perfect. But no one knew that Karen Weber was about to try to change all that. At 4:45 p.m., while the party was in full swing, Karen Weber finally decided to take action. She had spent the last few hours documenting everything about the party that she didn't like in her notebook. Now she walked back into her house, picked up her phone, and made the call she had been planning all day. 911, "What's your emergency?" the dispatcher asked. Karen's voice became dramatic and shaky. "Yes, I need to report a disturbance at 1234 Maple Street. There's an extremely loud party with dangerous activities. Children are screaming, and there's some kind of unauthorized structure in the backyard. I'm concerned about safety and noise violations." What Karen didn't know was that the 911 dispatcher, Maria Thompson, had already received several calls that day about the party, but not complaints. Other neighbors had actually called earlier to praise how well organized the birthday celebration was and to comment on the positive community involvement. "Ma'am, is this about the Johnson family's birthday party?" the dispatcher asked calmly. "Yes." Karen's voice rose higher. "They're disturbing the peace. There must be at least 20 kids running around, making noise, and doing dangerous experiments. Someone needs to shut this down immediately." The dispatcher typed notes into her computer while listening to Karen's complaints. She could hear the children's happy laughter and music in the background, but it wasn't particularly loud through the phone. Meanwhile, back at the party, Marcus and his friends were having the time of their lives. Mr. Wilson had just finished showing them how to make elephant toothpaste, a safe but exciting chemical reaction that created a colorful foam fountain. The children clapped and cheered at the scientific display. "Can we do it again?" several kids asked excitedly. Sarah was helping serve more snacks when she noticed Karen pacing back and forth in her front yard, still on the phone. She was gesturing wildly and pointing at the party while talking. "David," Sarah called to her husband quietly, "I think Karen's calling the police." David looked over and nodded calmly. "Don't worry, we have all our permits, and we're following every rule. Officer Martinez already checked everything earlier." Mrs. Rodriguez overheard their conversation and stepped closer. "That woman has been taking pictures and videos all day. I saw her writing things down too. She's clearly trying to cause trouble." Other parents at the party started noticing Karen's behavior as well. Mr. Chen walked over to the Johnsons and showed them something on his phone. "I've been recording too," he said. "But I've been recording her harassing behavior, just in case we need it." The DJ, who had years of experience with parties, kept the music at the perfect volume, loud enough for fun but quiet enough for easy conversation. He had been checking his decibel meter regularly to ensure they stayed well within legal limits. Back on her phone, Karen was getting frustrated with the 911 dispatcher. "What do you mean you've already heard about this party?" "No, I don't know if they have permits. But there are too many black and brown children running around. This is a quiet neighborhood." The dispatcher's voice became very serious. "Ma'am, are you calling 911 because of the children's race?" Karen suddenly realized what she had said. She quickly backtracked. No, I'm calling about the noise and safety issues. This is a residential area." "I understand, ma'am. We'll send officers to check the situation," the dispatcher replied professionally, while making special notes about Karen's racial comments. At the party, more parents were gathering near the Johnsons, offering their support. They had all noticed Karen's strange behavior throughout the day. "We've lived here for years," Mrs. Wilson said. "She's the only one who's ever complained about anything in this neighborhood." Tommy's dad, Mr. Chen, added, "She complained about our Chinese New Year celebration too. Called it suspicious activity. The police came and ended up staying for dumplings." Sarah felt worried, but tried to keep the party going smoothly. She didn't want anything to ruin Marcus's special day. The children were now getting ready for the last science demonstration, completely unaware of the drama unfolding. "Look, Mom," Marcus called out excitedly. "We're going to learn about light refraction." As Sarah watched her son's happy face, she heard police sirens in the distance. They were getting closer. Karen Weber stood in her front yard with a satisfied smirk, thinking she had finally won. But things were about to take an unexpected turn. 2 police cars pulled up in front of the Johnsons' house with their lights flashing but sirens off. Karen Weber stood triumphantly on her lawn, arms crossed, watching as officers James Martinez and Lisa Thompson stepped out of their vehicles. Finally, Karen called out, hurrying toward the officers, "I've been documenting everything. This party is completely out of control." Officer Martinez held up his hand politely, stopping Karen mid-sentence. "Ma'am, please give us a moment to assess the situation." He already knew the Johnsons well from the community youth program, but he maintained his professional demeanor. Officer Thompson, whose daughter was actually in Sarah Johnson's class, took out her notepad. "Can you tell us specifically what violations you're reporting?" Karen pulled out her notebook excitedly. "First, the noise is unbearable. Second, they've got some kind of unauthorized bouncy castle. Third, they're doing dangerous experiments with chemicals. And finally, there are too many pay." She stopped herself before finishing the word people. The officers walked toward the backyard, with Karen following close behind. What they found was very different from what she had described. The DJ's music was playing at a reasonable volume. Officer Thompson checked the decibel meter on her phone, confirming it was well within legal limits. Children were taking turns in the bounce house, with David Johnson carefully monitoring the number of kids and their safety. "Mrs. Johnson," Officer Martinez called out professionally, though he was fighting back a smile, "we've received a complaint about your party." Sarah walked over, carrying all their permits and paperwork in a folder. "Yes, officer," Here are our permits for the bounce house, our noise permit, and the safety certifications for all our science activities. We also have parental consent forms for every child attending. Officer Thompson reviewed the documents while Officer Martinez walked around the yard. He noticed Mr. Wilson, the retired science teacher, safely supervising the experiment station. All the children wore safety goggles, and every experiment used household materials. This is one of the most well-organized children's parties I've ever seen, Officer Thompson commented, handing the permits back to Sarah. Karen's face turned red. But what about all these people? This many children in one place can't be safe. Ma'am, Officer Martinez turned to Karen. Their gathering is well within capacity limits for a residential property. Every safety measure is in place, and they have proper supervision. Just then, the dispatcher's voice came through on both officers' radios. Be advised, the complainant made concerning comments about the racial makeup of the party attendees during the 911 call. Karen's face went pale. Officer Thompson looked at her sharply. Ma'am, did you call 911 because of the children's race? Several neighbors who had been watching stepped forward. Mr. Chen spoke first. She's been harassing multiple families in the neighborhood. I have videos of her previous complaints about different cultural celebrations. Mrs. Rodriguez added, she called the police on my daughter's quinceañera last month, claiming it was a suspicious gathering. Officer Martinez took out his own notepad. Mrs. Weber, filing false police reports and misusing emergency services is a serious offense. Additionally, if these calls are motivated by racial bias, that adds another layer of concern. I was just worried about safety. Karen stuttered, backing away. The only safety concern I see, Officer Thompson said firmly, is the unnecessary stress you're causing these families. We'll need to file a report about this incident. Meanwhile, the children had gathered around, curious about the police presence. Marcus stepped forward bravely. Officers, would you like some cake? It's got a microscope on top. Both officers smiled. We'd love some cake, Officer Martinez said kindly. But first, we need to have a serious talk with Mrs. Weber about proper use of emergency services. Karen watched in disbelief as the officers not only didn't shut down the party but joined in. Officer Thompson even put on a lab coat at the photo booth, making the children laugh. This isn't over, Karen muttered as she stormed back to her house, but nobody paid attention to her threats. Sarah and David shared a relieved look. Their son's party hadn't been ruined. If anything, it had gotten even better. The community had stood together, the truth had come out, and justice had been served. As Officer Martinez enjoyed a piece of the science cake, he quietly told Sarah, we'll be following up on this incident. No one should have to deal with harassment in their own neighborhood. The party continued, now with two special guests in uniform, while Karen Weber watched from her window, finally learning that her attempts to spread hatred had only brought the community closer together. As the party continued into its final hour, something remarkable began to happen. More neighbors started arriving, not just to support the Johnsons, but to share their own stories about Karen Weber's past behavior. Mrs. Patel approached Officers Martinez and Thompson, who were still enjoying the party. Last month, she called code enforcement on our family because we were cooking Indian food. She claimed the spices were suspicious substances that needed to be investigated. The officers took detailed notes as more residents stepped forward. Mr. Jackson, an elderly African-American man who lived 3 houses down, shared his experience. She reported my grandson's car as suspicious when he was just dropping off my groceries. This has been going on for months. Sarah and David listened to each story, feeling a mix of sadness and anger. They had no idea how many of their neighbors had been suffering in silence. Tommy Chen's father pulled out his phone and showed everyone a folder full of video recordings. I started documenting everything after she called the police on our Chinese New Year celebration, Mr. Chen explained. I have at least 7 videos of her harassing different families. She always uses words like suspicious or disturbing, but it's clear what she really means. Officer Thompson shook her head as she reviewed the evidence. This is a clear pattern of behavior. We're going to need statements from everyone affected. This goes beyond just today's incident. Meanwhile, The children continued enjoying the party, completely unaware of the serious conversations happening among the adults. Marcus and his friends were having their last turns in the bounce house, their laughter filling the air. Mrs. Rodriguez, who had been quiet for a while, suddenly spoke up. "We should form a neighborhood watch committee. Not to keep people out, but to protect everyone from this kind of harassment." "That's an excellent idea." Officer Martinez agreed. "The police department can help set it up officially. We can provide training and support." David, who had experience as a community organizer, pulled out his phone and started a group chat. "We can use this to alert each other when anyone experiences harassment. No one should feel alone in this." Karen Weber, still watching from her window, could see the community gathering. More and more neighbors were arriving, sharing stories, and showing evidence on their phones. Her face grew increasingly worried as she realized her actions weren't going to be ignored anymore. Sarah noticed some parents looking at their watches. It was almost 6 p.m., and the party was scheduled to end. She started organizing the cleanup, but to her surprise, everyone insisted on helping. "Let's show Karen what real community looks like," Mrs. Wilson said, picking up some paper plates. The scene that unfolded would be talked about in the neighborhood for months to come. Adults and children worked together, cleaning and packing up. Some neighbors brought out additional trash bags. Others helped fold tables and chairs. Officer Thompson, still present, made some calls to the police station. "We're setting up appointments for everyone to make official statements tomorrow. This kind of targeted harassment needs to be addressed properly." Mr. Chen walked over to David with an idea. "We should have regular community gatherings. Make it clear that diversity is our strength." "Monthly block parties," David agreed enthusiastically. "Each family can share their culture, food, and traditions." As the bounce house company arrived to take down their equipment, Karen finally emerged from her house again. She tried to approach the officers with more complaints, but they stopped her firmly. "Mrs. Weber," Officer Martinez said seriously, "we've uncovered multiple incidents of you filing false reports. We'll be in touch tomorrow about the consequences of misusing emergency services." Officer Thompson added, "And we'll be investigating whether these reports constitute a pattern of bias-motivated harassment." Karen's face turned pale as she realized her position. She hurried back to her house without another word, closing her door firmly behind her. The sun was setting as the last guests prepared to leave. What had started as a children's birthday party had transformed into something much more significant, a community coming together to stand against hatred and discrimination. Marcus, tired but happy, looked at all the people helping clean up. "Mom," he said, "this was the best birthday ever. Not because of the party, but because of all our friends." Sarah hugged her son, tears in her eyes. Today had shown them the true strength of their neighborhood, and it was beautiful. Stice takes its course the morning after Marcus's party. Things started happening quickly in the neighborhood. By 9 a.m., Karen Weber received an official notice to appear at the police station regarding her misuse of emergency services. She stood in her driveway, staring at the paper with shaking hands. Meanwhile, at the police station, a steady stream of neighbors arrived to give their official statements. The Chens brought their videos, the Patels had saved threatening notes Karen had left on their door, and Mrs. Rodriguez presented recordings of Karen yelling at her children for speaking Spanish in their own yard. Officer Thompson sat at her desk, carefully documenting each case. "The pattern is clear," she told her sergeant. Every single complaint Mrs. Weber made was against families of color. Never once did she call about any of the white families' gatherings. The police department's community relations officer, Sergeant Lewis, reviewed the growing file of evidence. "This goes beyond simple neighbor disputes," he said seriously. "We're seeing systematic harassment based on race and ethnicity." Back in the neighborhood, David Johnson had organized a community meeting in their backyard. More than 50 neighbors showed up, bringing chairs and snacks. Even people from nearby streets came after hearing about yesterday's events. "We need to make sure this never happens to another family," David said, standing in front of the group. "I propose we form an official neighborhood association focused on diversity and inclusion." Mrs. Wilson, the retired teacher's wife, raised her hand. "I can help write the bylaws. I used to be a legal secretary." Mr. Chen stood up next. "My security company can donate cameras for families who feel threatened. We'll install them for free. The meeting was interrupted when two police cars pulled up in front of Karen's house. Officers Martinez and Thompson walked up to her door and knocked firmly. The neighbors watched as Karen answered, her face pale. "Mrs. Weber," Officer Martinez said loud enough for everyone to hear, "based on the evidence we gathered, you're being charged with multiple counts of filing false police reports and misuse of emergency services." Officer Thompson added, "The district attorney is also reviewing the case for possible hate crime charges, given the clear pattern of racial targeting." Karen started to protest, but stopped when she saw all her neighbors watching. Many had their phones out, recording this moment. She had no choice but to accept the citation papers the officers handed her. Local news vans began arriving, having heard about the story through police channels. Reporters interviewed several neighbors about their experiences. Sarah Johnson spoke eloquently about the importance of standing together against racism. "This isn't just about one birthday party," she told the cameras. "This is about making sure every family feels safe and welcome in their own neighborhood." Marcus, watching the news cruise with wide eyes, tugged on his mom's sleeve. "Mom, are we on TV because of my party?" Sarah hugged him close. "We're on TV because our community showed that love is stronger than hate, sweetheart." By afternoon, the story had spread to social media. Hashtag Standing Together started trending locally as people shared similar experiences from their own neighborhoods. The police department issued a statement encouraging other communities to report patterns of discriminatory harassment. Karen Weber stayed locked in her house, watching through her windows as her world crumbled. The cameras she had used to record her neighbors were now being used as evidence against her. The notebook where she had documented her complaints was now proof of her harassment. The Neighborhood Association's first official act was to create a support system for families facing discrimination. They set up a phone tree, a group chat, and regular meeting schedules. Mrs. Rodriguez volunteered her large living room as the meeting space. "We should celebrate everyone's cultures," Mr. Paddle suggested. "Monthly festivals, food sharing, cultural education, make diversity our strength." As evening fell, Karen noticed moving trucks pulling up to her house next door. Word had spread about her actions, and no one wanted to live next to her anymore. Her landlord, embarrassed by her behavior, had decided not to renew her lease. The day ended with a spontaneous gathering on the Johnsons' front lawn. Families brought food to share, children played together, and the adults discussed plans for making their community even stronger. Sometimes, David said to Sarah as they watched their neighbors laughing and talking, "It takes one person's hatred to show us how much love we really have in our community." 1 week after Marcus's birthday party, the neighborhood had transformed in remarkable ways. The incident with Karen Weber had sparked a movement that was spreading beyond their small community. Local news stations continued to follow the story, making it an example of how communities could stand up against discrimination. Early Monday morning, Karen Weber was seen loading the last of her belongings into a moving truck. She had barely shown her face since receiving the criminal charges. None of the neighbors offered to help her move, a stark contrast to how they usually welcomed and said goodbye to residents. "Good riddance," Mrs. Rodriguez whispered to Sarah as they watched from their front porch, drinking coffee. "Now we can focus on making positive changes." The first community meeting was scheduled for that evening in the local community center. Over 100 people showed up, including residents from nearby neighborhoods who had heard about their story. Officer Martinez and Officer Thompson attended as community liaisons. David Johnson stood at the podium, looking at the packed room. "What happened at my son's birthday party was terrible," he began, "but it led to something beautiful. Tonight, we're here to make sure no family ever feels unwelcome in their own neighborhood again." The meeting agenda was full of positive initiatives. Mr. Chen presented his security camera program, which had already received donations from local businesses. Mrs. Wilson shared the draft of their new neighborhood association bylaws, which included strong anti-discrimination policies. "We're setting up cultural exchange days," Mrs. Patel announced excitedly. "Each month, a different family will share their traditions, food, and customs. Everyone is welcome to participate and learn." The police department had also taken action. Sergeant Lewis introduced their new rapid response protocol for handling discrimination complaints. "We've learned from this incident," he explained. Our officers are receiving additional training in recognizing and dealing with bias-motivated calls. Local schools reached out to Sarah Johnson, asking her to help develop diversity awareness programs. As a teacher, she was perfectly positioned to help children understand and celebrate differences. We're starting with simple things, Sarah told the group. Teaching children about different cultures, traditions, and the importance of respect. Marcus's class is already working on a diversity project. Speaking of Marcus, he had become something of a local hero among the kids. His birthday party incident had started conversations in many homes about racism and standing up for what's right. He took his new role seriously, making sure every kid at school felt included during recess. The media attention brought unexpected support. A famous civil rights attorney offered free legal services to help them establish their community organization properly. Local businesses donated supplies for their monthly cultural celebrations. We've already received calls from 5 other neighborhoods asking how to set up similar programs, David announced proudly. Our story is inspiring others to take action. The district attorney's office updated them on Karen's case. She was facing multiple charges, and her case would serve as an example of the consequences of racist harassment. More importantly, it showed other communities how to document and report similar behavior. Mr. Jackson, the elderly gentleman whose grandson had been reported by Karen, spoke about his experiences with racism. I've seen a lot of change in my lifetime, he said, his voice strong. But what happened here, how everyone stood together, that's the kind of change we need more of. As the meeting continued, they planned their first cultural celebration. The Chen family would host, sharing Chinese traditions and food. Everyone signed up to help with preparations, eager to learn and participate. This is more than just meetings and programs, Mrs. Rodriguez said, standing to address the group. We're building a real community where everyone's voice matters, where our differences make us stronger. The local news crew, still following the story, captured the energy in the room. Their reporter noted how a negative incident had transformed into a powerful movement for positive change. As the meeting ended, Sarah found Marcus helping younger kids make welcome cards for new families moving into the neighborhood. Mom, he said, looking up with a smile, my birthday wish came true. What did you wish for? Sarah asked, curious. For everyone to be friends, he replied simply. And look, now everyone is. The room filled with laughter and chatter as people made plans for future events, shared contact information, and promised to stay involved. What had started with one racist neighbor had ended with a community more united than ever before.